You help me welcome Jenna Ellis.
Thank you for having me. Some of you know my background then going into law school was confronted with the arbitrary nature of law and how it's taught. That pre-1973, abortion's illegal, and then suddenly at the drop of a hat, the Supreme Court changes its mind, and suddenly now what is prohibited in a society is now permissive. Well, we know that the immutable moral truth of God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so our moral law and truth has to reflect that. So I went through kind of a crisis of faith of reconciling to myself, well, how does law actually interact in a legitimate society? How does this work? And how can we as Christians stand firm on truth while still using this wonderfully complex document that is the Constitution and have a better argument than just, well, I believe, therefore. And so we need to have just a better way of persuasion and a better way of advocacy. And so that's what my book is all about. It's called The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution. And I wrote it after going through, frankly, a crisis of faith that was very deep and personal in terms of understanding law and how God ordained moral society and how we can best advocate for that. Frankly, you all are so privileged to be part of one of the few churches left in America that's willing to stand for truth and is willing to interact in civil society and is willing to say that certain things are right and wrong depending only on Scripture and the Bible. And that's a very, very good thing. And so I'm thankful for Pastor Paul's leadership in that. And that's the reason that I get to be here, because I am a member now of the Trump 2020 Advisory Board, which is yes, yay, go Trump. We need to get him reelected. I'll say that. And with that, I'm not a paid campaign spokesperson, so everything that I say is not should be taken only as my personal opinion. It doesn't reflect the campaign's position, but I'm very privileged to serve the president in this capacity and be able to go on national news, write for national outlets, and to be able to reflect the truth of moral law in the context of our United States Constitution. And so what I wanted to share with you tonight, and what is really on my heart tonight, is the idea, and we're going to get to a couple of very specific things going on in our country right now, and I want to give you some tools to combat the false, fake news narrative that's out there. But I wanted to challenge you with this question. We all know that we are Christians, right? And when people ask us to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, hopefully all of us have a response to that question of, why are you a Christian? Well, if someone were to ask you, and this is my challenge for you, if someone were to say, well, why are you a conservative? Or why are you a Republican? Sometimes those two things aren't necessarily the same, unfortunately. So I define myself as a conservative. And if someone were to ask you that, what would be your response? We are conservatives because we're Christians first. And we have to understand that the Christian worldview is the best explanation for the reality to which God presented us. And so our Christian faith touches and concerns and infiltrates literally everything that we do. So we can't separate our Christian faith from our political viewpoints, from our philosophy, from our day-to-day lives, from our marriages, from anything else that we do. And so being a conservative is because we are Christians. And when I taught for Colorado Christian University for several years, I noticed that my students, many of them very, very sincere Christians who were there, have been caught up in this ideology of libertarianism. And some of you may identify more with libertarianism than conservatism. And I also want to challenge you that philosophy at its root is actually secular humanism. It's just a different way of describing the role and responsibility of government that isn't predicated on a Christian worldview. Conservatism is conserving something. We are conserving truth. We're conserving the legitimate role of government in our society. We understand that, as President Trump so eloquently said at the Values Voters Summit, I was very privileged to be there when he spoke to the audience and said that our rights come from God, our Creator, and they will never, ever be taken away. That is truth, and that is the only legitimate purpose of government. And we see that in our founding documents. We see that our Declaration acknowledges that truth is, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator, not their government, with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it goes on to say that the only purpose of government, therefore, is to preserve and protect those God-given rights. And what we've done is flip that on its head and say that the government can tell us when we can exercise freedom of speech, when we as churches can stand up and say, this is what is right and wrong in society, this is what we're advocating for in the political sphere, this is what we're advocating for in the legislature, that they're taking away, that's part and parcel to our free exercise of religion, really. It's part and parcel to our freedom of associations, to who we are, and understanding that protecting the church government system, protecting us here, our right to freedom of association, speaking about our sincerely held beliefs, in the context of our family, training up our children in the way they should go, understanding who we are individually as people created in the image of God. All of that requires and necessitates protection of our liberties and our rights, especially our first freedoms, freedom of speech, association, and free exercise of religion. So we have to conserve that truth. And the reason that I say that libertarianism is very, very much a threat to that, and I'm very disconcerted seeing that on the far right, especially among my generation, millennials and Gen Z and younger, is because they understand that the progressive left and wanting the government to dominate everything, and what the Democrats said on the stage last night, which they were all so far left that they were, I think Babylon Bee even said like the stage was crashing down and falling apart because they were all so far left. That's really what was going on. I love Babylon Bee. And that there's a lot of truth to that. But what libertarianism is doing is saying that instead of big government deciding what's best for you, your churches, and your families, it's up to man himself. And so we become then the God of our own kingdom. We reject church authority and oversight. We even reject government's legitimate ability to promote good and restrain evil, as it says in Micah 6:8. So libertarianism is this idea that government's only purpose is to arbitrate consensual agreements. And as long as there's consent, it's not the government's job or responsibility to legislate according to moral truth. That is excising morality and that component from government. And that's saying that, hey, as long as you don't touch me, your truth is fine for you and your family, my truth is fine for me and my family. So libertarians often will have some positions that are conservative, but many, many positions, especially on the social issues, the LGBT agenda, abortion, all of these things where you'll hear a lot of Christians say, well, I personally wouldn't do that, but who am I to tell someone else that they can't? Well, you are saying that who is God to tell them that they can't, right? And who are we as a civil society that is predicated on the immutable truth of God, that looks to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, as our supreme authority. And our declaration acknowledges that, calling him the supreme judge of the universe. And our founders knew and acknowledged that he, as the divine lawgiver, is the source of our moral authority. He's the source of our rights. And therefore, our Constitution only has legitimacy, and our government only has legitimacy when we operate according to protecting those independent and individual freedoms as human beings made in the image of God. So we need to have a response that, yes, because it's biblical, because it's truth, that's why we're conservatives. Because everything that I do should be a reflection of my Christian faith. And it should be a way that we can advocate in every sphere of government. We have to advocate it here in the church and also in our individual families, but absolutely out in civil society as well. And so with that, that has been the fundamental attack that we have seen against, in particular, President Trump's administration. And I have seen that attack firsthand. I was very involved in the media with Justice Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, and that just insanity that was going on and that attack. If we have another Supreme Court opening, I can tell you for sure that there will be a battle even worse than Justice Kavanaugh. And we need to right now be praying for that, be praying for those on the Judiciary Committee, and be praying for President Trump. I mean, just daily, the types of attacks and the manipulation of the left is just overwhelming. And there is so much fake and false narrative that is trying to destroy this administration because he and those around him are promoting good and restraining evil. They're doing exactly what the executive branch within the margins of the Constitution provides for. I mean, imagine that, right? We're actually seeing that. And I wish that I could say the same for Congress, and I wish I could say the same for the Supreme Court. And eventually, I think we will see that in the Supreme Court if we actually have a majority of conservative justices. Right now, we're kind of at a tipping point, right? It'll be very interesting to see where Chief Justice Roberts ultimately falls. And I think that he has now become essentially the Anthony Kennedy of the court. We'll see if he's going to hold for objective truth and originalism, or if he will make decisions based on his political beliefs and his own personal opinions. Originalism is not saying that just because I'm a Christian, I win my case every time. No, it's making sure that decisions are based on the Constitution and are based on the specific limited vested powers in the legislature and also in the executive branch that are simply checked by a separation of powers in the Supreme Court. So I like to give my students an analogy if you've ever played Monopoly. Some of you may have heard me give this analogy before. If you've ever played Monopoly, I always like to be the little Scotty dog, and that's always like my piece. And I like going around. And the whole idea behind playing a game or any other board game is that you play by a certain set of rules for a specific goal. And if you don't play by the rules, either you don't know the rules, you're playing a different game, or you're cheating, right? And so there is a rule book to make sure that there's fairness and to keep the players in check. That's exactly what our Constitution does with the policy players that are in our government branches. And so we elect individual representatives to basically control the pieces of policy in our legislature and in our executive branch. And so when those powers, the power to move the Scotty dog and make the determination, do I buy Boardwalk if I land on it? Well, that's a policy decision, right? And if I'm the elected person to move that piece and make that decision, then I'm able to according to the rule book. But I still have to make sure that I abide by those rules. And if I decide, well, you know what, I'm going to roll for a 5th time just because I want to, nobody can stop me, right? Well, then that's where the Supreme Court needs to step in and say, wait a second, legislature, wait a second, executive branch, you can't do that. The rule book says no. But what the Supreme Court shouldn't do is look into the rule book and say, you know what I think is probably best overall for this game? I kind of don't like the Scotty dog. I like the thimble better. So I'm going to tell the Scotty dog that they can't do that. And it's nowhere in the rule book, but I'm going to make that policy decision for them because I'm actually advocating for a different piece on the game board. That's what our Supreme Court is doing in terms of activism. They are reading between the lines of the rule book of the Constitution, and they are making policy decisions based on their own preferences. And that's what originalism means, is that you don't look at policy, you don't look specifically at the outcome of policy, you only look at, can you do this according to the rule book? So when people are saying that President Trump is appointing originalists, that doesn't mean that he is promoting activists for the conservative right. That is a false misnomer. And when people say, oh, well, Trump's just getting his activists on the bench, we need to correct that. And we need to say that's not what originalism says. That's not what conservatism says. We are conserving our rule of law and our Constitution, which, by the way, sorry, liberal left, sorry, Elizabeth Warren and others, that's genuine equality. That's actually fairness. That's actually due process. That's making sure that everyone is playing by the same rules. And that's what originalism is. And so President Trump and his administration have successfully confirmed over 150 federal judicial appointments that are lifetime appointments. And yeah, we can clap that. Yeah. We can clap to that. That, I think, has been the most significant accomplishment of his administration because they're lifetime appointments. So this will not just be a policy that can be overturned by the next administration or be reduced. That is something that will carry on for the lifetime tenure of these appointments. And that's why back in 2016, even though President Trump, then candidate Trump, didn't have a track record, that's why I, as a Christian, was absolutely supporting him, and why I was very proud to openly advocate for him and to vote for him, because the judicial branch matters. It matters so much. And so when we look at the Supreme Court, and even this particular term, which started last week on Tuesday, the Supreme Court, even this term, is going to be dealing with some very, very important cases that will determine the landscape of whether or not your and my individual freedoms are protected. So a couple of those cases, last week, speaking of Mike Ferris, he's now actually the CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom. Full disclosure, I'm an allied attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom. I'm not paid by them. All that means is that my bar license is in the state of Colorado, and so if there are ever cases that arise that they give to the allied attorneys, they're a nonprofit, and so they will send cases to state and local attorneys first before anything ever gets to the Supreme Court. And so recognize that your individual state and local policy matters. Masterpiece Cake Shop case, everyone's familiar with that with Jack Phillips. That started in Colorado because of Colorado's absolutely crazy anti-discrimination law and our Colorado Civil Rights Division that is basically a modern day Star Chamber. That is a quasi-judicial branch of unelected, unaccountable members who are these decision makers who really don't have any specific authority to do this from a judicial setting. There is not due process. So when they made that finding against Jack Phillips and it eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, it made its way to the Supreme Court only because Colorado law was so terrible and still is so terrible. I was working with the Colorado legislature at the time when the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was up for what's called a sunset review. Basically, it was going to be defunded unless the legislature decided to refund it. So it was the perfect time for conservatives to say, hey, let's attach some stipulations and some requirements, like an opt-out, that basically someone in Jack Phillips' position would be able to say, I don't think I'm going to get due process here. I don't agree to that particular forum. I want to go to a regular court with a judge that has accountability not only to his bar license, but also to be retained in our judicial merit system, that the voters every 4 years get to decide whether or not that judge gets to stay on the bench. There's a lot more accountability. But because of the breakdown in the Colorado legislature, that unfortunately didn't get passed. And so Colorado is still a just hotbed for all of these issues. But that's why this matters. And so a couple of cases that are coming up in the current Supreme Court season, and they're going to accept a lot more cases, so definitely be looking at their docket and their calendar. There are a few things that you should be aware of. So the one that was argued by Alliance Defending Freedom, again, who represented Masterpiece, it was actually one of 3 cases that was argued on the definition of sex within Title VII. So that provision that was passed by Congress on a federal level was intended specifically to protect women, the biological immutable difference between men and women. So when you say sex, it means the difference between men and women, period. And the Equality Act, some other different measures to expand that definition have been attempted to go through Congress that has never been accepted by our federal legislature. It has always stayed the same definition. But now the LGBT agenda is wanting to expand the definition of sex to include what we call SOGI language, or sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a move by the progressive left to break down that difference between men and women. And so the case that Alliance Defending Freedom argued is a case of a funeral home that has a dress code for men and a dress code for women. Seems pretty standard, right? But then one of the employees decided that as a man, he wanted to start identifying as a woman and therefore wanted to adhere to the dress code for females. And so he filed a lawsuit under the anti-discrimination law in that particular state, and he said, this is unfair because I'm a woman now. And so this is now going all the way up to the Supreme Court to say, does a business, a privately held business, have the right to simply impose a dress code, right? So this has a wide-ranging impact depending on how the court draws their holding and how they decide this. Are they going to circumvent the legislature, and are they going to read between the lines of the Monopoly Rule Book of the Constitution and say, sure, we're going to circumvent the legislature, we are going to decide that this term sex actually includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So if men want to identify as women, that's okay, and employers, churches, small business owners, you can imagine, will then have to cede to an individual person's sexual orientation or gender identity over and above our sincerely held religious beliefs. And so that's one of the main issues that is at stake at the Supreme Court. So be praying for the outcome of that. The oral argument should be posted as of, I think, last Friday, if it's not yet. And you can go in and you can listen to that oral argument. It's Harris Funeral Homes versus the EEOC is that particular case. The other main issue that's going to be addressed at the Supreme Court this term, of course, is abortion. Now, we know as Christians, abortion is murder, period, full stop, right? And there are no exceptions to that. Abortion is always defined as a medical intervention to necessarily and intentionally cause the death of a human child, right? I mean, that's just, there is no way to get around it. And abortion is always an intentional medical choice. And so when there are a wide variety of pushbacks to that and arguments, but we know that abortion is always intended to kill an unborn child. That's just what it's intended for. And so as we look at the confirmation hearings of Justice Kavanaugh and just this wide range of absolute hate and threat against the Trump administration, it is because the Trump administration is so incredibly pro-life. Within the margins of the president's authority, he has defunded Planned Parenthood to the greatest extent possible, which is amazing and incredible. And that is so significant, and a lot of people will push back on that and say, well, yeah, but look, Congress is still giving that. Well, Congress is responsible for that. And so we as conservatives also need to remember that even when we get a president who's doing so much good, we can't want our president to overstep his constitutional authority any more than we wanted Obama to. Right? That's what it means to be a conservative, to still say, hey, President Trump is playing by the rule book just as much as we wished Obama had. Okay, so we have to at least recognize that President Trump has stayed within his constitutional margins. And that's why it's so important to understand the separation of powers and why our vote in Congress matters. But abortion is going to be a very, very huge topic. There's already one series of cases that has been accepted by the Supreme Court, and this is going to be an ongoing issue with fetal heartbeat laws, some of these other things that are being at war within the states. Though the Supreme Court is not going to be able to ignore that for very long. And so we need to be praying for the outcome of these cases and that it would genuinely be conservative and that it would genuinely be protecting life, because we do see that the right to life is one of the most, it is the fundamental right, because without that, without the right to life, we can't exercise any other rights. That is the very, very first freedom, and it has to be protected for all. And in all circumstances, in all cases. And the set of cases that is being taken up is a series of cases that's actually started with a Louisiana law. This particular law was very similar to the case in Texas that was decided in 2016 about abortion access. So right now the standard in the Supreme Court is whether or not there is an undue burden. If a state has an undue restriction on a woman's so-called right to access abortion. Okay, so one of the things that you have to remember when you're talking about the right to life and being pro-life is also term it that way, pro-life and anti-abortion. You know, don't talk about people being pro-abortion because that makes them sound better, right? They are anti-life. They are for death. That's really what they are, for death on demand. And be very specific and intentional with your words. And so in the context of these cases, Roe versus Wade did not find that there is a constitutional right for women for abortion. That is not what that case stands for. That case found a right to privacy within women's healthcare decisions in some circumstances. And it set up this balancing test to say, well, is there an undue restriction versus, or an undue burden versus a woman's right to access that? Now, that balancing scale can be tipped. And so right now, if Roe versus Wade is overturned, that can be done in a variety of fashions. And this particular case in Louisiana is contemplating whether or not a Louisiana law that simply says that abortion providers have to also have admitting privileges at a local hospital. That's it. And wouldn't you think that that just makes sense? I mean, abortion is not a small procedure. It's very medically invasive. It's something that if this were a criminal defendant, I mean, there are so many ways that, there are so many things that criminal defendants will say, even getting a needle in my arm for the purpose of a blood test is invasive. They make all of these arguments, and somehow the left is arguing that abortion isn't invasive. Like, that's crazy. And so they are trying to say that this is an undue burden for these physicians to have admitting privileges at a local hospital, because heaven forbid, what if something goes wrong, right? Shouldn't they be licensed medical professionals? And so this particular case is going to reanalyze that, and depending on how the justices make their holding, this could very well impact Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and all of these other cases, and the abortion just license, really, that our country is looking at. And so we need to be praying, and we also need to be advocating definitely for the right to life in society, because if we simply set this on a secular humanist ground and say, and make the argument, well, I would never choose abortion, but it's okay for you. And I know a lot of us are not that way, but that's a lot of Christians will concede to that argument and will say, well, I can't tell a woman what's best. It's between her and her doctor. I was on Shannon Bream's show where some advocate who had been some higher up at Planned Parenthood made that argument. I said, you're forgetting the other person in the room. It's between the mother, her doctor, and her baby. There's a third person in that room, and you are completely ignoring that. And so we have to stand up and we have to be bold, because these decisions are coming down, and I genuinely believe, and I am praying for that abortion to be absolutely outlawed nationwide in the next couple of years, because that absolutely can happen with the current composition of the Supreme Court. But that also needs to happen on the state and local level, because if the Supreme Court simply says, listen, this isn't a federal issue, this should be decided on a state-by-state basis, then we know that there are liberal states like New York and California and others that will allow abortion on demand, and that women will simply travel to those states. Now, that'll be a little bit more difficult, but that's not the goal. The goal absolutely, and we should be very bold in saying this, the goal absolutely is to protect all human life, and to make sure that we're protecting that. That goes from conception, and it goes all the way until natural death. With some of the other laws that have been passed in states like my home state of Colorado, the physician-assisted suicide bills. I mean, this is the same thing of saying that somehow we are playing God and can choose when we ourselves have a right to die. That is actually going against the right to life, because who gave us our rights? Our Creator, God. Now, we can choose to exercise them, yes, but we cannot buy, sell, or infringe or impose them in any way we want. We still have to exercise them within the context of the reality to which God presents us. And the Bible clearly says that He knows the number of our days. It is up to God when He calls us home. And that's absolutely against the moral truth of Scripture to say that we should allow for physician-assisted suicide. So from that whole spectrum of life, we can see that the liberal left is simply anti-life, and they are anti-God. And that is the position that they are advocating for. And it genuinely scares me to see how open they are with their socialist liberal agenda to try to undermine absolutely everything about our country that was premised on individual rights and freedom under God, our Creator. We are one nation under God. What does that mean? I can exercise my rights, and the government can't tell me not to. They can put some limitations, of course, time, place, and manner restrictions, things like that. But we are still a nation under God, and that means we are under the moral truth of God. And like President Trump said, our rights will not be taken away. And that's so incredibly important. So then the other thing that I want to, as I'm conscious of the time, that I want to talk to you about is the impeachment narrative going on. And for those of you who are, watching all of this and just see it for what it is, I want to give you the constitutional argument, kind of in a nutshell, so that you are equipped to go out and talk with your neighbors on your social media, whoever you interact with. Because you may think, and I actually gave a presentation at the Values Voter Summit to a lot of young people who really wanted to be social media influencers. And that's kind of the big deal right now, right? And they're thinking, well, I only have 1,000 followers. And I thought, you know what, though? That's how many of us would love to speak to a room of 1,000 people, right? That's what you get to do on social media all the time. So don't diminish the platform that God has given you. And don't diminish the idea that having a conversation one-on-one with people won't have an impact. I have never turned down, if I possibly can manage it in my schedule, I don't turn down interviews. I don't turn down speaking engagements. I will go and speak if it's a room of 10 or if it's a room of 10 million. I mean, it doesn't matter, because you are still making a difference. And so when you engage these people with these conversations and with this truth, then realize you are still being an advocate for truth in the place that God has you for today. My dad gave me some of the best advice I've ever gotten in life, which is do today what God has for you today, do it well, and then see what he has for you tomorrow. And today, what he has for me today, speaking with all of you, what he has for me tomorrow is going to be something else. And, to get to the point of having, some appearances on Fox News and some of these other things has only been because I've done every day what God has asked me to do, and he has opened those doors. And for whatever he has and he's called you to, do today what he has for you today, and then worry about tomorrow. And so that was kind of a long way of saying, so when you are interacting with people about the whole impeachment narrative, it's helpful to say that, this is just a Democratic strategy to oust President Trump and all this, and that's all true. But we have to go beyond that. We have to actually say why. Because if we're just, spouting this whole, the left hates Trump, that's true, but we need to be able to provide a reasoned argument for it and some substance. I wrote a piece in The Hill probably about 2 weeks ago. You can find it on The Hill under, my last name is spelled R-I-V-E-S, by the way, Rives. So Jenna, Ellis, Rives. You can find any of the work that I've done. Hopefully that'll help you with your arguments. The title of it is something like, the case from the impeachment against President Trump is a coup or something like that, but it's in The Hill. And I lay out the constitutional argument for what impeachment is and what it's not. And if you look at Article 2, Section 4, that's the language that gives the House the power to impeach a sitting president, and then the Senate to hold the trial with the possible punishment of removal from office. But that has a very, very narrow legal basis upon which impeachment papers can actually be filed. Okay, so it says that a president can be impeached upon treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Often you will hear the liberal left or the talking heads on TV talk about high crimes and misdemeanors. And what they're doing is they're wanting you to think of misdemeanor like we would think, running a traffic light. That's a misdemeanor, right? But in context, in the original language of the Constitution, it's talking about crimes that are so grave against the sovereignty of the United States that it rises to the level of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That term high crime actually comes from the Old English of high crimes against the crown, right? Because that was English common law at the time. And it was treason. And so we're talking about substantive acts that are by definition criminal and by definition so severe that there is proof that the office holder, in this case would be the President of the United States, is acting specifically contrary to the interests of the United States. So this would be like him giving, foreign aid for the purpose of coming in and invading our country. Something literally that severe. Now, can we have allies? Can we have mutual benefit? Absolutely. We do that all the time. And so in this context, what the Democrats in the House are trying to pull the wool over America's eyes with is that they are trying to take a phone call of Ukraine where President Trump was congratulating the president of Ukraine and then asking one of our allies for help with an investigation of a potentially corrupt dealer who, by the way, was our former vice president. Kind of a big deal, right? So let's also remember that the president of the United States just because he's running for re-election, does not cede any of his vested constitutional powers just because he's running for re-election. Those two things can and always do happen simultaneously. If you're running for re-election, by definition, you are the current office holder, okay? So when they're saying, well, there's some sort of quid pro quo and there's, there should be immunity here and it's clearly, getting opposition research against a potential candidate. Well, if that were true, then every single person who's possibly concerned about corruption charges would simply sign up as a Democratic presidential candidate and say, sorry, can't investigate me, right? That's ridiculous. And so for the President of the United States, who, by the way, is over the Attorney General, who is the chief law enforcement officer under Article 2 of our country, he can and should investigate corruption of a United States citizen, especially someone who was a federal office holder at the time. And just because that person happens to potentially probably after how he's done in the Democratic debates, probably won't get the nomination, so won't be an opposition candidate, but potentially that doesn't diminish the legitimate exercise of authority of a sitting U.S. president to ask one of our allies for help with investigation. That's completely permissible. And so if we look at that, we see that there isn't a quid pro quo because President Trump simply asked for assistance, which he's allowed to do. And by the way, the mainstream media is trying to say, hey, do me a favor. That's not the text of the transcript. Hey, do us a favor. Who is the us? The United States, right? He's not talking about a personal favor. So they're trying to manipulate it even in that way. So when we look at this, there is absolutely no quid pro quo because he's not actually giving something in exchange for that information. And even if he was, there's a lot of law around why, in this context, that wouldn't be a quid pro quo because by definition, that has to be corrupt intent. That has to be something that he's not legally able to do. A president has the power to declare war, has the power to make withholdings, has power to, like he's been putting tariffs on a lot of different countries to try to exert pressure for certain political policy decisions from some countries, like China and others that aren't necessarily our allies in certain ways. Why isn't that a quid pro quo, right? Because it's only because the liberal left wants to shoehorn this very vague definition into our Constitution and say that somehow that gives rise to an impeachment proceeding. That's simply absolutely false on the merits. And then how they're trying to go about this impeachment inquiry. This goes against precedent. The Constitution does say that the House has the sole power of impeachment. The Supreme Court has determined that word sole to mean that the House can set their own policies and their own procedures for how to do that. And that's true. But within that context, there still has to be fundamental fairness. There still has to be due process. There still has to be a fair and equitable treatment of someone who's the subject of an impeachment investigation that may potentially lead to criminal charges, which in the context of the President of the United States, an impeachment proceeding is by definition a criminal proceeding. It's the same type of process as an inquiry into a grand jury proceeding, for example. And every criminal defendant has all of the other constitutional rights at their disposal to exercise, which means that they don't have to comply with subpoenas. They don't have to comply with other investigations, talk to these investigators. Whoever heard someone saying, you know what, sure, I'm gonna just comply with everything and give you everything you need to make sure to have a criminal case against me. No person, whether it's on the local level or all the way up to the President of the United States, can't say, I'm not going to testify. I'm not going to, this is a skewed investigation. No criminal defendant that I've ever represented, I used to be a prosecutor, I've been a criminal defense attorney, I would always tell them, don't talk. Why? Because they will try to manipulate your words against you, even if you've done nothing wrong. And we've seen that history of the Democrats. And so when they're doing this so-called impeachment inquiry, they're going against what are the current established rules of the House. They're not even bringing it to a floor vote. They're not creating any type of due process. They're simply trying to create this vague inquiry. Well, what's the timeline? What's the procedures? What rights does the subject of the investigation have? They're trying to put so much emphasis on Giuliani, who, by the way, is the president's personal attorney. Just because you're the president of the United States does not mean you're not also Donald J. Trump's citizen. Right? He has the ability to have an attorney representing his interests. That's fine. And every defense attorney can go and look at and investigate and talk to people on behalf of providing a vigorous defense to their client. So if we go back and we look at the context of the Ukraine phone call and what was going on at the time, what was going on? The Mueller investigation. President Trump had Giuliani as his personal attorney. But the Democrats aren't going to tell you any of this. They're not going to tell you and give you that context. And so they are not following procedure. They're not following any sort of timeline. All they're doing is wanting to make you and me scared to vote for this president because they want to taint him first with, the Mueller stuff and Russia. Then when they finally saw that horse is so dead, we can't beat it anymore, then immediately, it wasn't even, I think somewhere like 10 days later, they were starting to investigate this. Why? Because they know they can't win at the polls. They know that President Trump has more support than he did even in 2016. They know that he is winning on behalf of America, and they want to somehow take him out or take him down in any way possible, and they are almost literally burning the rule book. And that should scare every single one of us, regardless of who we vote for or voted for. Even if you're a supporter of one of the other Democrats, even if you voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election, our U.S., you can laugh, that's fine. That was a joke. Even no matter whether you like President Trump or not, what you should like and love and be willing to defend to the death is this great American country that is built on the idea of fundamental fairness and preserving and protecting liberty. Okay? Yeah. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of not only what President Trump is doing, but also giving you some real substance in terms of the impeachment inquiry. And be praying, by the way, because probably impeachment is going to pass in the House, surely for political hatred. And so then it's going to be up to members of the Senate Judiciary Committee that do have the majority to make sure that this is a fair process. And it's going to be a very interesting time in our nation's history. Prayer is the most powerful tool that we have, and we need to be praying with knowledge and also with hope that the Bible defines as sincere expectation.
Hi, Jenna. Thanks for putting this on. My question is, we always hear that the Supreme Court offers an opinion. So what does it mean if a state or another body decides to not, adhere to that opinion?
Follow their opinion. So the heart of your question is really civil disobedience, right? In the either the individual, the state, or whatever. So Supreme Court opinions, they're termed that, or holdings, or some people say rulings, and that just means that that's the judge or the referee's decision, right? And so I really think that a convention of the states is warranted to make sure that we check and balance the judiciary's authority, because the founders never intended for the judicial branch to basically be the only unchecked branch. The Supreme Court right now is really the most powerful body in the United States, because there is no way to vacate that opinion but for a future Supreme Court reversing it. So that's why we're seeing that all of these states, so in the context of abortion, why all of these states are passing really great laws, but then we have to be hopeful that those won't be overturned by the Supreme Court. And so the context of the question, I would say it depends, because we may not like a particular decision that the Supreme Court holds, but if that opinion is either constitutional or it's what the founders would have termed as a light or transient cause, I may not like that, on this particular road outside, I can only go 25 when I think really I should be able to go 50. That's okay. That's not an infringement of my rights. But if we're talking about something so severe as an infringement and it's so unconstitutional, then we have to make a decision where we're at. And if you are a state legislator, if you are a member of Congress, or if you're just an individual, where does that impact you? And our founders faced that same question. They faced that question of, how are we going to deal with England, Parliament, and the King so severely restricting a multitude of our rights, the chief among them being religious freedom. And they answered that question by doing absolutely everything legally possible before they exercised their right of separation and dissolution. And so where it comes down for us, I would just say that we need to do and follow their example by doing absolutely everything that we can first. And that's why I support the Convention of States project, because that is trying to make sure that we can reform our judicial branch. But it'll depend. I was speaking at the National Association, or the American Association of Christian Counselors, and talking to Christian counselors about how the LGBT agenda is impacting their ability to counsel. And I had a similar question to that, where a counselor said, what if I have to go and I have to provide advice based on these restrictions that goes against my sincerely held belief? And I said, you have a choice. You can either leave the job, you can stand up, or you can advocate for yourself. And I would always choose advocate for yourself, personally. I would say go into the board of the hospital and say, listen, I can't do this based on these principles. How are we going to reconcile this? See if you can have an appropriate solution. But at the end of the day, when it is a moral issue, stand firm. And how the Supreme Court impacts us, just because I don't like that abortion is legal, well, I'm not participating in it. I'm not going to directly fund it. I'm sure, there are places that I patronize that, they choose to give their dollars. I can't always affect that, but what I can do is advocate the best that I can. And if and when it comes down to me standing up, and if a government like, I'm forgetting the country right now that is just saying, it came out today that said that they were going to coercively impose abortions on women. If that were me in my body, I would stand up and say, no way, and would stand firm, because that is absolutely my choice at that point, right? So if you are confronted personally with that decision, it's an easy one. We look at, the voices of the martyrs. We have to stand firm.
Amen.
But until it gets to that point, be very, very careful when and how you exercise civil disobedience.
Amen. Amen.
What is Ruth Bader Ginsburg's status? Is she still alive?
According to the Babylon Bee, she might be a bot right now. We don't know. So of course, we don't wish ill to anyone, but we can wish for them to exit their job, because they're not doing well. I mean, they should actually be removed because of how much they have abandoned their oath of office.
Is there a process for that? If she becomes incapacitated, I mean, does that equal death in this case, because let's say she's in a coma, or she just cannot do what she was hired to do?
It depends, and just like we saw with the death of Justice Scalia, the Supreme Court can still operate with only 8. So it depends. But there would be, a process, I think, eventually, probably if she was incapacitated and was not expected to return, then there may be some pressure on her to simply step down and say, she's done, she's not returning to work. I genuinely believe that any other one of those 17 Republicans that were running in the primaries would have abandoned Kavanaugh. But President Trump stood by him, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
Amen.
And I've met him and his wife and his 2 daughters, and they're wonderful.
Awesome.
Okay, so I'm going back to impeachment. So it's kind of a twofold question. Number one, you think it's going to pass the House. What's the process after that for those of us who aren't so literate in that process? What's the process after that, and what do you expect will happen? And 2, what does that mean in terms of the next election? And how does that process impact the next election?
Yeah, and those are great questions. And you're right there with Adam Schiff and a bunch of these other people that don't know how it works either. So that's fine. But how it's supposed to work is that if articles of impeachment are filed based on actual legal bases, right now it's just a political game. And right now, it literally is just if they get a majority to pass it, right? So I think it's going to pass only because the Democrats have the majority in the House. And they're going to do this as a last-ditch effort to undermine the legitimacy of the next election. It's going to be purely political, not legal, not constitutional. And so this impeachment and any other, proceeding like this that's within the context of our Constitution should not be political or policy unless it's specifically designated so. This is a separation of powers for a reason, because this is something that, again, is so huge to actually remove a sitting president. It shouldn't be based on, I don't like you, and undermining our vote. We, the people, elected President Trump through our constitutional process. They can't undermine it simply because they hate what he's doing. I mean, then get better candidates. That's the whole idea of a free and fair election. So the process is that the House will eventually, once they have held their inquiry and whatever, they will eventually have to file impeachment papers, which is essentially the criminal charges of what exactly they are charging him with. They're going to be very careful how they do that, because that's basically the indictment. Once that passes in the House, then it's turned over to a trial in the Senate. So the Senate actually is the jury in that context. The Chief Justice, so Chief Justice Roberts, will preside over that trial, and then it will be up to a 2/3 majority of the Senate that would have to vote guilty, which, again, if they're voting guilty, then it's a criminal charge. This isn't, a lot of the liberals will tell you this doesn't have to be criminal. It absolutely does. It's a conviction. and it says a trial and conviction. That word is inherently criminal law in context. And so then the Senate would have to actually make a finding of conviction based on the impeachment papers, and then the punishment for conviction in that context is removal from office. So what we saw this last time, the last time that this happened in our nation's history was with President Bill Clinton. He was impeached but not removed. So the Senate didn't find him guilty, and they didn't, so he was not convicted in the trial, so therefore he didn't receive the punishment of removal. So that's the process. It's very straightforward and simple, but the problem is that it's been hijacked to be a political process rather than a constitutional and legal one. And then your second question was, how does this impact the election? Hopefully, it will impact the election for President Trump. And we saw actually the RNC's numbers were that for the third quarter, President Trump actually had over $125 million in campaign donations, which was the highest in the same quarter of President Obama's first term looking at re-election was $77 million, to give you a comparison. So this was huge. And so we can see that there are so many people like you and me that are so frustrated with how much our Constitution is being set on fire by the Democrats that we are stopping at nothing to put our support behind President Trump because of this. So I think that how it plays out in the court of public opinion is going to be a different question. And that's why I'm willing to go on CNN, and for those who, Lord, if they have ears, let them hear, to say, here's what this really is about constitutionally speaking, because what they're going for right now, they know they can't win a trial in the Senate, but they are trying to undermine the legitimacy of the process, and they're going for a vote for the Democrats in the court of public opinion. They're wanting to scare us into not re-electing Trump. So.
Thanks, Jenna.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jenna, for being here this evening and for your presentation. You mentioned the Convention of the States, and should that be approved, and because our federal government really does not follow the Constitution now, if a Convention of States was to be approved, what measures are in place to keep the Convention of States from going rogue and attacking other areas of our Constitution, such as the Second Amendment, and changing that on us? That is a concern of several of ours.
And and I get that question all the time. What about a runaway convention? So we actually do follow the Constitution in a lot of different ways. I'm a woman, I can still vote. Yay, right? So we do. We do follow a lot of the Constitution. We still have, there have been a lot of different ways that the states and also Congress have tried to undermine the Constitution, like the National Popular Vote Initiative. I mean, this is ridiculous to think that state legislators can actually unilaterally amend the Constitution and overturn the Electoral College. I mean, that's absurd. You have to go through Article 5. So there are a wide variety of ways that the left is trying to do this, but overall and generally speaking, we still do follow much of the Constitution, and we still do follow much of the law. It's just in ways that the left is trying to manipulate it. So how do we then make sure that a Convention of the States is not run away? Mike Ferris actually gives, because he was, before he went to Alliance Defending Freedom, a huge advocate and an open advocate for this, along with my friend Mark Meckler. So I would encourage you to go to conventionofstates.com and to look at all of the resources, because they answer all of these questions and others. But the short answer of this is that right now, if we look at the composition of the state legislatures, the states are who controls this convention. Okay, so it's not Congress. Congress can only set the time and place. They have nothing else to do with it. And so when the states send their delegates, then because we do still have a majority of conservative states, and so we still have the majority, just like the Senate, right? Right now, we're not concerned about what's going on in the Senate, because we know that the Senate is acting with originalism and it's not, taking over by the liberal left. So right now, it's surely numbers. And those states that are going to be sending delegates will make sure to stay within the actual subject matter that a constitutional or a convention of states. It's not a constitutional convention, by the way, at all. It's not going to rewrite the whole thing. It is a convention of the states for the very same purpose and power that Congress can try to introduce a bill to amend the Constitution every day that they're in session, right? Well, the states also have that power to call a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments, but it has to be an agreed upon subject matter. They can't do something like just unilaterally decide, hey, we're going to also repeal the Second Amendment, all of that. And also, I also get the question, what if the Second Amendment were repealed? There have been other measures for conventions of states on different subject matters. We've only never had one in our nation's history because no one's ever agreed on the subject matter. The Convention of States project for the threefold purpose of judicial reform, balancing the budget, and term limits in Congress. That's the only things they can touch. What if there were a Convention of States for the purpose of repealing the Second Amendment? Well, in context, we have to understand that the Bill of Rights doesn't actually give us our rights. If the Bill of Rights were repealed today, I still have every single right that God gave me, not my government, right? So I prefer to call it a Bill of Protections. Alexander Hamilton put it the best in Federalist 84 when he talked about how a Bill of Rights wasn't even necessary, because his argument was, why should we tell Congress you can't do something by which we don't give it actual authority to do? So the same argument that I made to the Colorado legislature was, why am I telling you you can't amend the Constitution and get rid of the Electoral College when nothing in the state or federal Constitution gives you the power to do that? Read it. You don't we can have a conversation about the Electoral College, but this isn't the appropriate forum. So even if our Second Amendment was repealed tomorrow, we would still have the God-given right to self-defense. We would still have the God-given right to keep and bear arms. That's not something that our government gives us. It's something that our Constitution specifically says, Congress, you can't touch it. You can't touch it. So we need to understand our Constitution in context as well.
Clearly, the Lord is never going to be president.
Yay. Thank the Lord. Yeah, okay, all right.
However,
Hallelujah.
he made a statement that I can imagine the other knuckleheads, if you will.
Yeah, he's the only one stupid enough to actually say it.
Yes, how he's saying that the rights of churches will
Right.
be removed as far as tax exemptions if they don't allow LGBTQs
Yeah.
and support them. Obviously, we know where Trump stands, but how close to actually them doing that can it possibly get to? And two, I get tons of mail asking for donations for Trump. Mm-hmm. Where can we really send money where we know it's going to the right place?
Go to donaldjtrump.com. That's the campaign website. Everything, if you want to volunteer in your state, if you want to get involved, donaldjtrump.com is the official website for that. Do donations through there. I know that there's some legitimate Facebook ads and other social media stuff or whatever, but if you want to make sure that you're sending it to the right place, do it there. And as far as your other question, I mean, this is just ridiculous. This is also like O'Rourke saying that, we're going to make sure to take away all of your guns. And if we think, that you still have guns, we're going to send a federal agent to knock on your door. I mean, this is just, I truly believe that this would set off the next civil war if he actually was put in office. I mean, this is literally absurd. This is not our country. This is not our country. But thankfully, we do have a separation of powers. Unlike Kamala Harris and some of the others that say, first day in office, within the first 100 days, I'm going to require that the legislature does X, Y, Z. Well, guess what? You're not part of the legislature anymore. If you want to do that, then stay in your Senate office, right? So we do have a separation of powers. And as much as people want to say that, President Trump is acting like a dictator, look at the rhetoric from the Democratic left. They're the ones that want to be dictators. President Trump isn't actually doing any of that. So in terms of the nonprofit status of churches, the IRS has never actually removed the nonprofit status, the 501c3 status from a church for disagreement on issues. What Beto is basically saying is that he's going to remove the tax-exempt status if you don't agree with what he believes. He's exercising his sincerely held beliefs, which are atheistic, secular, humanist, whatever, and he has a right to speak those beliefs. But what he doesn't have the right to do is tell you and me what we have to do in the context of our churches and our sincerely held beliefs. So even if Congress or some executive order, whatever, in the future at some day in time, and we can pray that this doesn't happen, but even if, I guarantee you that the Becket Fund, Alliance Defending Freedom, all of these other people would represent cases, and it would go to where? The Supreme Court, right? So that's why we have to make sure, and why the judicial branch is so incredibly important, because that's where the true battle is going to happen. And these federal judges that impose preliminary injunctions, nationwide injunctions, it's all just this legal battle. I think if we are looking at this from an originalist, a constitutional view, then absolutely the nonprofit status should not be taken away at all. There's no legal or constitutional reason for that. Whether or not it will happen really depends on the makeup of our government. And that's why Benjamin Franklin says a republic if you can keep it. And that's why we need to be responsible civic citizens and actually participate in this process. And again, I am so thankful that Pastor Paul is willing to have someone like me come in and talk about these things, because a lot of churches are so scared of that very thing that it's a self-inflicted sort of prophecy. They've removed their own status themselves, right? They've removed their own ability to freely speak. Why are they so scared? They shouldn't be. We absolutely have the constitutionally protected fundamental right given by God to freely speak, associate together about God and our religion, full stop.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please do.
Would you guys still give if you didn't get tax credit?
Yeah, I don't.
Do you think God is limited by money? Do we need a tax exempt status to be able to function as a church?
No.
Do other people in the rest of the world have it? No. No, they don't. We are very privileged. This is something we should take advantage of. And when in our giving, you should take your deductions. But you know what? We're not subservient to that. We serve the Lord. We don't. It's not about money for us. Amen. Amen.
The Chief Justice presides over the trial in the Senate, theoretically as a referee like a judge would in a courtroom. Mm-hmm. Constitutionally, how much can the Supreme Court intervene even in the House? How much of the procedures are dictated? If the House suddenly goes off the rails, can the Supreme Court come in and say, stop,
Right.
You can't do that?
So the House has sole power for impeachment, right? So the Supreme Court, it's an interesting question. It's never really in the precise way that you're meaning been challenged. So it depends on how much they're willing to say, okay, there are some limitations on how completely partisan political this can get. So it would depend on whether or not the sitting president would challenge the process and would challenge in a legal fashion, basically appeal a vote of impeachment based on a constitutional rationale. That would be the only possible way I could see it reaching the Supreme Court before a trial in the Senate. And that's possible, and it would really be determined by whether the Supreme Court was willing to answer that question and say this is something that is a justiciable reason, meaning in legal speak, it's something that they can determine as a matter of law. And my guess based on past precedent, but again, it really depends now that we have originalists on the court, whether or not they would find that to be justiciable or whether they would say, you have the sole power of impeachment, so if you decide these are the papers you want to file, full stop, we're just now moving on to a trial in the Senate. I think it would be a very interesting question, one worth pursuing, to say that there are still protections for the defendant in this case, which would be the President of the United States. So my legal answer is it depends, and we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, Alan, last question.
Do we know who in the executive branch changed the ruling that you don't have to be an eyewitness to be a whistleblower? Do we know who actually did that?
Right. So that was done. I don't have a specific answer to that at this point, but we do know that the process for a whistleblower complaint was changed in order to facilitate that this whistleblower could be a second-hand, didn't have to have first-hand knowledge, and that should tell you everything you need to know, and that's why they went out and found the second whistleblower that, guess what, had first-hand information? Well, we all have now seen the transcript, so who really cares? But they're still investigating that. I don't have a precise answer to that right now, but let's hope they get to the bottom of that, and I think they will. Thank goodness, and thank the Lord that President Trump is a fighter, that he's willing to stand up, finally, yes.